Hello, everyone. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin, and I have the last installment of our video series from the Tata Steel Masters tournament in Vikenze in the Netherlands. The final three rounds, 11, 12, and 13, covered here. And to no surprise, Magnus Carlsen emerged as the winner, a very easy winner, in fact. But we'll go as we go through the last three rounds. I will start with Magnus's game from round 11. But the first thing that I have to talk about is the stunning news that Daniil Dubov was out of the tournament and missed the last three rounds after a positive PCR test for COVID. Now, you might recall that he earlier forfeited a game to Geary when he was deemed a close contact of someone with COVID, and the organization said you have to wear a mask for your round until we get back the results of the PCR test. And his opponent Geary was fine wearing a mask, and there were other instances of players wearing masks on occasion. But he said, no, matter of principle. Well, it seems like he didn't take COVID safety seriously enough and ended up missing the last three rounds, which was certainly a pity for him, but also kind of rough for the tournament. As three players got forfeits down the road, and that of course affects the standings. Magnus Carlsen was one of them. But let's look at his game with Vidit, Santosh Vidit. And what's interesting about this is that Vidit is able to hold this game, and that was the only half point he managed in the last four rounds, as he just totally fell apart. So this treatment with knight c3, there are a heck of a lot of Giocco pianos in this event, and this knight c3 stuff got a little bit of a workout. Sapenko played it as well. But this a4 combined with the move b3, this seems to be a treatment that Aronian came up with. So the bishop holds the line, and White is looking to get some play with his open files. So understandably, Black breaks in the center with d5. And it's a very small margin for White. Magnus is basically playing a two results kind of game. And he trades the queens. And basically from here on, it seemed that Vidit went about trying to make the draw in as direct way as possible. Just kind of force matters. And that begins with the move e4, which is an okay move, but Black is certainly okay with other moves as well. d4. Now White has, play on the b file and maybe potentially against f5, g4 break somewhere. But it takes the bull by the horns with f4. And Carlsen can continue in a number of ways, but basically they're all around equal. But you guys all know that this is the stuff that Magnus tends to win when nobody else does. And he gets very close. It looks like a whole lot of nothing. But now White has ideas, possibly just even ditching this g2 pawn, bring the king to the center, winning b6 and getting pass pawn going. So again, Vidit takes a concrete approach, knight check. And now he could just play knight f6. If White trades, the b pawn is defended. If White moves away, the knight can defend. And although it doesn't make an immediate draw, it basically holds the balance. The move rook e8 was actually extremely dangerous and gave Magnus what he was playing for. Not because of rook takes b6, because then the king comes to the middle and White actually doesn't have any winning chances. But the key was the d pawn, and White cuts the king. And now it gets very real. So Vidit has to work out to get his rook behind the pawn. And this is actually the key moment. With d7, Magnus loses his winning chances. But it appears that rook e7 check, bring the king up, and then rook back to e4. This seems to be winning. A big key to this is the fact that black is not able to get in b4. And it's not really a good moment for black to be chasing the white king. If black pushes a5, then white is in position to play d7, and if b4, rook e8, white will queen and then stop the pawns with the rook. But once a5 is pushed, now rook check, white can remove one of the pawns and then come back for more, and that's clearly hopeless. So basically, there just isn't the move that black needs. White wins some critical time by slowing down this b pawn. And Magnus missed that. That's really kind of surprise. I think he was, getting a little bit low on time, but not so much. But after d7, first black puts the king in front of the pawn, and then b4, and now the pawn is just too far. White has all these various ideas, but now he's holding back the pawn further ahead, and this is just not enough time for white to make it happen. He can't really build a bridge because the b pawn is too far, and he tries preventing rook f5, and there with rook e6 he builds that bridge, but it's just too slow, as black is also able to make a queen, and after that it's an obvious perpetual check. So Magnus could very well have won that too, and yeah, kind of surprising that it held that. He had lost to Praggnanandhaa, and as we see, the finish of the tournament was a complete disaster for him. Well, one of the guys who was chasing Carlsen was Anish Giri, and he just got massacred by Jordan van Foreest. Why don't they call him JVF? We have MVL, he should be JVF. Maybe people do, I don't know. But you gotta like Van Foreest, who came on at the end of this tournament and made a plus score. So it wasn't a complete fluke that he won last year. He shows he belongs. And not only is his level pretty high, but you got to like the way he plays. He goes after it. He had a lot of decisive games in this event. And he plays the A3, the same as Nimzo Indian, which was actually pretty successful in this event. And Giri kind of gets led into a kind of all or nothing variation, where he goes all out after the pawn. Now, Giri plays queen d7, which is one of the moves. I think c5 has been played. Some people played knight b3 and taken the bishop. I just have to bring everyone's attention to the move d5. Very quirky move. If c takes d5, black can take the bishop and take back, and the knight can land on e4 if it's attacked. So that's why it's effective against the move f3. But if the move e takes d4, then queen e7, and black is poised to maybe get back the c4 pawn. So this move d5 is a stockfish equalizer. It's never been played by anybody. Maybe after people watch this video, they'll notice that and they'll play d5. But it's not such an intuitive move to first of all allow the undoubling of the pawns, and secondly because the e6 pawn is pinned if white takes with the e pawn. But we got to this situation where the white pieces are tied down to defend the pawn, but white has this impressive center. And I think there was one game in the database where black castled queenside, and that would be the way I would go. I would definitely go that way. E5, well, maybe. I think that I can see that move. But castling kingside, wow, that's a lot of chutzpah, because Geary is encouraging the sacrifice on f6, and maybe White could have gone for it right away. It looked dangerous there, but Geary actually allows him to do it in the most favorable possible way with c5, and now he comes back to defend, but the White attack is just too strong, and capture the pawn in c4 is not happening because the knight is coming into f5. So Black really has to is going to have to retreat the bishop to keep that knight at bay. But then the bishop comes around, and the fact is the black piece is just doing nothing. The knight in a5 is not helping in this situation. And on top of that, Geary didn't defend this very well. I think it's a very rough position anyway, but rook h6 just loses some time. According to the engine, almost all these black moves are wrong. Now bishop g4 is coming. Rook g6, and bishop h5 can be played here, not to take the rook. If black plays rook f8, not to take the rook, but to go h3, which is very similar to what Van Foreest did. He allowed this capture, but now bishop h5. And if rook h6, White will take the bishop and take on f6, and mate will come very fast. So he has to sacrifice the exchange, but here he also loses the pawn in f6. And the big problem is he's going to lose the pawn on e5 as well, queen h4, a nice move, because rook e8 would get flattened by knight f5. Pawn takes is immediate mate with queen g5, but even bishop takes, pawn takes, and White's going to take on g6, and that's going to be over. So rook f8 to keep pressure on f6 to prevent knight f5, but now White is just going to win this pawn on e5 and maintain the attack. So he rolls the pawns forward. Knight comes back to e8 belatedly, at least preventing e6, but the knight is going to jump in. Okay, so trying to keep some pressure on the d6 pawn to keep the white queen honest, but Van Foreest thinks for a few minutes and finds a very nice finish, beginning with knight e7 check. Okay, plays king h8. If king f8, White can take the pawn on g6, and queen h6 check. So if king g8, he takes the pawn, comes back to h6, and then he's ready to finish with a check on the g file. And we see that Black cannot flee, because now White could win with rook e3, with the idea of queen h8, or even most accurate is queen h8 and f7. That's the ball game right there. So after knight e7, king h8, actually they'd already made the time control when he played knight e7. But now a very nice finishing move, rook h3, threatening knight g6 and destruction. And I think that was the last move. The point is that if Black takes the rook, then d7. So it's just to clear the path for the pawn. And now the threat is queen b8 with a back rank mate. And if Black guards that back rank mate, White can take on g6. Pawn takes is mate 2. King g8, knight takes. Threatens, various mates with queen check. Takes, check, check, check. And he can promote the pawn, although the engine points out humorously f7 is a faster mate and queen the f pawn. So a nice attacking game by Van Foreest, very accurately played. But Geary, what was he doing? He just got himself into a very bad situation, and he was unable to get out of it. Now there was another decisive game Caruana, who really kind of flip-flopped after starting with a bunch of draws. He was very up and down, and he wins this game with black, as he often did in this event. He won 3 games with black, but he lost 3 games with white. So very odd tournament for Caruana. And let's see how he handled the young Indian player who actually had a very good finish to this event. So it's standard kind of opening Slav. And an interesting moment is this move A4. So white is looking to play A5 and grab some space there on the queen side. So black plays A5. And the question is, who does that help? Well, white can argue that potentially the B5 square can be at his disposal because he has a knight on C3. So if a C pawn ever recaptures on D5 or moves, then that will come to B5. But the way the game went, Caruana said, well, maybe I'll use that square. I'll make you sorry that you gave me that square. So he put the bishop there, which put a kind of a kibosh on white looking to advance in the center. So then the game really kind of slowed down. So a lot of maneuvering around. And what would have happened if Prague had done something like H3, just waited? I don't know that there's much that Caruana can do. I'm not sure that he wants to break with C5 and risk weakening his pawns. But then came knight E5, and although this move is not so bad in itself, it gives black an opportunity because now he has a majority of pawns on the queen side. And things went wrong pretty fast for Prague. Knight E2, that move is okay. But now knight D4 is just very time wasting, as that knight is just going to be kicked back. White could play takes and queen D3, although looks probably better for black. Knight G3 is also possible here. But look what happens. Now black gets a winning position very simply. He just makes a pass pawn on the queen side. It's essentially an extra pawn because white's kingside majority isn't going anywhere. And that's basically what he does. He just wins that extra pawn. He trades. And now he takes advantage of another inaccuracy, knight C3. Bad timing, because now black takes. I thought that was a no-brainer. Get rid of that knight, which covers a lot of squares. But also he has this follow-up with bishop E4, getting rid of the bishop pair. And now black is able to penetrate on light squares. And also this pawn runs. Now, he could have stopped it where it is, queen A2, queen A4. It's not really going to help. So he let the pawn run all the way to A2. And now you might think, well, black will bring the knight over to the queen side, maybe try to win C4. But there's some logistical problems. The knight can be hanging sometimes. I really like what Fabi did. G5. He just sets up a kingside attack. He's going to put the knight on G6, and that's going to hook onto the knight H4, or possibly advance to the H pawn, and basically just soften white up on the king side for the queen and the excellent queen and knight combination to attack. He doesn't necessarily need the A pawn, and in fact, he's going to give it up. So the queen goes unexpected way, threatening mate in 2. Provokes the F pawn forward, and now he can actually even just give up the A pawn. A very nice finish. White resigns because the big threat is knight F5 and knight G3 mate. And white can really only defend this by giving up a lot of material. It's the power of the queen and knight combination. So nice technical win for Fabi, but sometimes you need a little bit of help for your opponent to make some mistakes, and hang himself. And when Fabi was black, that was working for him. But when he was white, he was the one doing the self-hanging. So the tournament did not end all too well for him. All right, so now we move on to round 12. And so now Caruana unfortunately had the white pieces against Magnus. That's a tough assignment. Of course, this was a big game because Magnus was paired with Dubov in the last round, so he was going to get a forfeit. So he you know, was on the verge of clinching the tournament almost with any result, but he did it in the maximum way, and we'll see how it went. C5. That's an interesting moment, right? This is certainly not a game Magnus needed to win. So you might say, well, why doesn't he play E5 and play into those very safe positions? But remember that Carlsen chose the Sicilian to play against Caruana during the World Championship match, and he was pretty successful with it. So he doesn't see any reason to go away. And Fabi decides not to challenge him in the Sveshnikov or anti-Sveshnikov. So we have Rosslimo variation. And I always like to play E5 in this position. I've played this a few times for white. And it used to be that black would take on D4, play into this position where white has the option of knight C3. Not that it's that great, but black can even take that away with D5, which is the more modern move order. And now this is a little bit of a new way to play for white. White, actually, I think after queen b6, white usually takes knight there, but so Fabi tried to hold on to that bishop. And now a very nice move, queen d8, because black wants to play knight a5, that's thematic. It just defends the bishop. The queen will be nice recapturing there. So there's no point putting the queen on a square. It doesn't really help. Bishop b3. Now, timing all works for black, knight a5. If bishop takes d5, not rook takes c3, which runs into bishop d2, but first bishop f5 hitting the bishop. So c4, e6, and if bishop b3, then black can safely take the pawn at c3, and he can capture the bishop when he needs to. So rook c1, and now knight takes b3. This is an interesting moment. I think really kind of shows a little bit of chess evolution, because maybe in the past, the grandmaster move might be just knight c4, just occupying that weak square. But just occupying that weak square isn't necessarily that big a deal for black, because then white has a little bit of a free hand to try to attack on the king side. But it actually makes a lot of sense to kind of tie white up by taking, and then he can potentially maybe create a passed pawn on the queen side, or he can break up white's pawns and get some weak squares back again. Makes sense to provoke action on the queen side away from the black king, the white king. White really has an edge on the king side with a pawn on e5. So this is just very practical. Queen a3. Now, maybe it's better to advance c4 and move earlier. I don't know. The game is fairly evenish. So white kind of controls this b file, but don't know that it's such a big deal. Knight d2 would have been a more effective move right away. And now comes queen e2. And now, strangely, the engine proposes knight f3 as the only move to hold the balance, to keep the queen from maneuvering. And bishop takes f3 would actually be a mistake, because now the black pawns on the queen side would become very, very vulnerable. So knight f3, but it's not a very human move to bring the knight back to the square where it came from. But after f3, boom, this exchange sacrifice was a no-brainer for Fabi. And it just creates a situation where black has the bishop pair, everything. This bishop just defends everything, and it's defended by the pawn on b7. and this pawn is weak. And it may be defensible for white with perfect play, but very unpleasant. You never want to have this against Magnus. And he ended up winning it very easily. And well, problem is that if rook takes, bishop f8, hitting that c pawn, bishop d4, rook d8, and white is just not coordinated for defense. The pawn on c5 is ready to go, rook c4, then the pawn can run all the way to the 7th rank, defended by the bishop. That's just over. It was also pretty much over here. It's a winning position for black once he gets 2 extra pawns. He has an extra pawn on the king side he can work with, and that a pawn, and white just he can't do anything, can't attack anything, is really powerless to change anything. So first he brings the bishop back. This is interesting. He just makes sure it doesn't get traded, because if white could trade bishops, then that might make a difference. Then he'd have some play in the dark squares. But as it is, he doesn't have play on any squares. Magnus takes his time. I mean, he has his choice of many maneuvers. All right, so he opens up the f3 square. Again, no bishop trade for you. Now here comes the king. It's just a matter of time. Rook f2, rook f3, but Magnus plays very accurately. And bishop d4, and he just gives up. I mean, if the bishop gets on the a6 f1 diagonal, it's over. And white is just really completely powerless. The exchange sacrifice just completely shut down Fabi, and with that was basically over, because Carlsen, had a point coming to him in the last round. So there was no drama whatsoever about how the tournament was going to finish. The game of the round, well, it's always a matter of opinion, but Sam Shanklin won a very nice game, and I think this was actually the first and only game he won in the event, which it sounds terrible, but he didn't lose a lot of games. He had a lot of draws, but you can't really go through this tournament without posting a win. You can't feel good about that, but he could feel good about this day. It was a very nice win for Sam. And it's a Nimzo Indian f3, which is sometimes kind of a cousin of a3. They can often transpose. And Karyakin played this sort of Benoni approach, or Benoni / Benko game, maybe Blumenfeld, Nimzo Blumenfeld, I don't know. And then bishop d2. 92 is another way to go about it. And so they get to stuff that's kind of known. Knight d7, okay, sacrificing a pawn, but getting some play, threatening knight d3 check. So he takes care of that, trades off that knight before it gets to d3, but now white is very vulnerable on the dark squares. So bishop c5, this seems to be a novelty. Queen c5 has been played in this position, and it seems that black has enough compensation for the sacrifice pawn with the dark squared threats. One idea is he can take the knight and come in and check and grab a pawn if white doesn't stop that. On queen e2, there's even a game where black castled queenside, which is a little radical, but anyway, black has play. Bishop c5, well, okay, that's okay. Queen e2, rook b8. But this move just fails tactically, queen b7. He could have played bishop d4, and again, compensation. His strong bishop posted there, for sure. The queen b7, white could have even taken on c4 right away, a little bit more forcing. But he gets around to the same idea. And Sam just calculates better here. Bishop f2, and he just moves the king out of the way. So now white is threatening to come in with the queen, and also threatening rook b1. And this is a big problem. According to the engine, the best black can do is queen b4, but then white can trade and take on f2. And he's just gonna play an ending with an extra pawn. Kind of depressing. So Karyakin felt fight with queen b3, but the tactics just work out for white. Queen c7, not only hitting g7, not only hitting e5, but also threatening rook b1. So a move like castles does not allow rook takes f2 because black ends up a piece ahead after rook c8. But instead, rook b1. Uh-oh, problem there. If queen f7, white can take this with the queen and then take on f2, and with 2 pieces for rook, white is a huge favorite to win the game. Yeah, so another possible move is bishop d4, but that this is the same problem, rook b1. So black it doesn't have a defense. He tried queen b6. Well, this looks like a defense, but unfortunately the move knight d5 is just absolutely crushing. A very cool variation is if black moves the queen, white can take on f2. And, well, now white's again just two pawns up, but this one gets made at queen c7. All right, he has to leave the e7 square open. King g6, not much choice. Either mate in 1 or you lose the rook. Check. Check. Now if g5, white can take the knight, threaten g4. It's going to be made pretty fast. King h6, queen f4, king h5, and g4 check followed by rook g1 is winning. The engine says g3, even stronger, threatening queen h4, mating, and there's no defense. So what can he do? He can give back some material. Rook e8, I think, is a forced move. And then white can take that rook and take. And now black actually comes out with 2 pieces for rook. The good news. The bad news is that white has his 2 extra pawns. The rook compares much more favorably to the minor pieces as you get in the ending where the rooks have a lot of room to move and black has no pawns in the center, nothing to anchor those pieces. So it's a lost position. He could have put up some resistance, but no, he fell on his sword with knight d5, and this just loses by force. Check, and now rook c1. The bad news: white is threatening to come in rook c7, and any defense to that runs into a fork. Rook b7 allows rook f2, and when you take it, queen d5 picks up the rook. And the other tactic is the rook coming to c8, white takes it, queen f5. So nice moment for Sam Shanklin as he puts a big win on the board against Karyakin, so he can at least take that home with him in a tournament where not all that much happened for him. Okay, there was another decisive game from that round. Vidit losing to Shakir Mamedyarov, and I won't go into too much detail about this game. I will note that it was a little bit of an interesting opening struggle where white tries to play very quick d4, without much preparation for it. So black brings the knight back, and then a4. This is really 21st century chess. Now knight takes d4 actually would lose a piece to knight b3, and the bishop is going to get trapped whichever way it goes. But it is possible to play bishop takes d4, and like I said, 21st century chess, the engine evaluates white's compensation as giving him a favorable position with the bishop pair. I don't think that 20, 30 years ago people would have thought to play this way. But Mamajev doesn't take the pawn. He just plays d5, hits back in the center. But as the bishop position goes on, it becomes favorable for white. It's kind of an odd isolated pawn position with the bishop sitting on b2, but he kind of makes it work. Gets all the piece playing, and then he rehabilitates that guy. And so the knight on the side of the board takes the bishop, and now white gets pawns in the middle. And bishop h6, a fancy move. Perhaps it was better just to play bishop f4, and this seems to be a plus over minus situation, because white is fixing to bring this knight to f4, trapping the rook, and it just seems that white just has a better game with this nice build-up of pieces. Bishop h6 was not a huge mistake. I think the engine says knight g6 was a missed opportunity, maybe some knight h4 tactics. After queen takes d4, white could again retreat the bishop to f4, but white played queen g4, rather shocking, just losing to f5. What was the oversight? Did he miss knight f6 could be captured by the queen? I'm not really sure. Just a howler, and Vidit just basically had to give up a queen for, well, basically nothing. And you know, he played it out a little bit because, you know, everybody was watching. But Shakhmami had no trouble putting this one away. And the final tactic, knight e3, if takes, bishop g3. And if king e2, black can take the knight and then fork on g2. So, yeah, a rough one for Vidit, and it got worse before it got better for him. Okay, so we move on now to the final round. So this is where Carlsen won on forfeit over Dubov, which you know, basically won the event for him. So that meant that his closest pursuers really had nothing to play for, and thus we saw a couple of quick draws. We saw Report and Daguerre. Actually, you know, one of those contrived perpetual checks out of the opening repetition, and Mamajarov Karana was a quick draw. So as those players just cemented, I should say, Report and Mamajarov cemented their second, third finishes. So you thought, well, there's one non-played game and two quick draws, but it still was a pretty exciting round, as Pragnanda, you know, coming off a forfeit win over Dubov, and he finishes with a real life win, and it was his third win to go with that forfeit. Now, he wasn't able to post a lot of draws in the event. The score wasn't huge, but still, you know, respect playing against guys that are, you know, 100 to 200 points higher than him. So again, the A3, and this is fairly well-traveled territory. And now with the pawn coming to f4, now black blocks that f4 pawn in place, diminishing the dark squared bishop and the knight. Now you might think like, wow, I don't allow double isolated pawns, but if you don't take and black solidifies that with d6, then the black structure is a lot safer. Bishop b3, coaxing d6, knight g3. Now in this position, there have been a lot of games where black has played g6, which allows bishop f5, but it seems like this might be good for black, because you have this kind of forced line. The queen is kind of pushed to the side, and then h5, I think, is usually played here. And black has a lot of attacking chances with this nice long diagonal and the g file. This bishop on e3 is, you know, stopped. It's not doing anything. So I'm not sure why Esipenko rejected that variation. It's possible that he forgot it. I knew that I forget these things. I don't know about guys at this level whether that happens. But 97 is a playable move, but it really kind of loses a little bit of time. So black ends up playing g6 anyway, and now white is getting ready to maneuver, put the knight on a better square, bishop h4, a little bit like we saw Van Voorhees do. Knight c8. The engine points out interesting possibility to play rook b8, trade rooks, and then go knight c8, so that white has not so many pieces to build up with. So again, the knight defends everything. That was a nice idea, a4. He plays to distract the knight. Now, earlier, Esipenko had a game, I believe it was against Grandelius, where he had a knight on the side at a4 and the worst position, and Grandelius allowed that knight to come into b2 and sneak into the middle of the board. But no such luck here, as Esipenko pays for that wayward knight. Knight d5. And now, in this position, he could have done better. He could have played, for instance, knight c7, and rook e7, rook f7, and a little surprisingly is a dead stop for white. So he could play knight e7. He can win in exchange. And then what does this all mean? Well, we could have things whittled down considerably. I mean, the move order can be slightly different, but this is sort of like a forced variation. And then we get to this position, white has an exchange, but very limited material. And, you know, I suppose it's, how many pieces? A little too many for the table base. But, you know, even if you see this variation for black, it's not so appetizing because, you know, you could be in for a tough defense. I mean, maybe you draw, but if he didn't want that, it was also possible to play g5, leads to just, you know, complicated position. But the way the game went, white just won an exchange. And at first, it doesn't look that bad. I was thinking, like, why is the engine saying massive for white? Well, it's just that, it's, you know, for one thing, his king side is very weak. Bishop f5 is a big threat. And black can eliminate that bishop, but now there's still lots of threats. Bishop f5 is still a threat. I think this was a moment when white could have played g4, and this seems to be a forced win by the attack. But Prague, I don't know if he didn't see it or he just felt that, you know, he was in shape to win by technical means, so that's what he goes for. This move queen e2, by the way, has a little bit of an idea to take on f5 and either pin the queen or get to take on h5. So he was able to win this a pawn, and now Esipenko dug in. And now we get this ending with a lot of maneuvering. Of course, Prague is, you know, taking his time with the moves, getting some time to think about it. So big key is this maneuver to b5, and black can't take that pawn without exposing himself to counterattack. And it's actually a little bit deceptive. It looks easier than it is. But Prague Nanda temporized with king e3. And it's strange, bishop e6, I guess Penko forgot about this move, and that really just wins. If knight e7, rook a7 check, and white takes on g6 and cleans out these pawns and wins pretty easily in the bishop ending, or possibly even a pawn ending from there. So I don't really know what happened with bishop e6. Black can play something like king to b8. Now, this kind of the germ of an idea that if, let's say, the king is not on the e file, king b8 can be answered by rook e1 and bishop e8. And if the king is on the d file, then white can play rook a8 and bishop a6. And that probably is enough for a win. But in this position, probably g4 is winning. If black takes with the f pawn, rook f1. If he takes the pawn, probably king f4, and perhaps at some point h5, and king comes forward. It's certainly a winning position. The engine gives it something like +7 or 8, which is kind of ridiculous, because when you analyze with engines, note that they have this huge score, and they keep giving this huge score when nothing happens because you haven't lost that advantage. But it's not quite so trivial to win as you'd expect +7 or 8. But I think that white would have won eventually. Okay, so we move on in the round. We have Grandelius against Duda, and this was a very sharp struggle with some very interesting moments. The Sicilian, and yes, we did have some Sicilians, and there was usually a fair bit of action in them. This is a classical, but the play is similar to a lot of Nidors in that we got action with kings on opposite wings. And I don't want to, spend a lot of time commenting on these moves, but we get to this position, and this is an interesting moment because, g5 is sort of thematic, but then if black plays h5, then the king side gets stopped up. Or he could actually play rook g1 first, and yeah, g5, h5 stops everything up. Probably would answer g5 with h5 on the last move. h5, this seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Doesn't he need that pawn to aid with g5? Well, no, he really just wants to keep black from closing the position. And after b4, now he goes g5. Bishop takes, f4. I should point out that after h5, black could have actually taken the bishop and then played f6. This is not something you see every day in Sicilian. The move f6 is usually considered to be very weakening, but it would stop g5 for quite a while, and then comes b4 and a5 and so on. But what Duda did was fine as well. b4, and now he finds the excellent move f6 and takes, winning the tempo on the queen. But now he goes wrong. He takes the knight, allowing white tactics. He could have just played queen b7, just defending the g7 pawn with the queen, still continuing to attack the knight. If the knight moves away, pawn e4 is hanging. So basically, black just has a big advantage here. The extra piece doesn't help white very much. But after he took the knight, that allowed bishop g7, and now, if black takes the bishop, he just gets the worst version of what happened in the game. So he took on b2, check. If white takes with the bishop, rook f7 is apparently balanced. So he took with the king, really forcing king takes g7, but it's good enough for a draw. It looks very promising for white, but the key is that black plays king d8 immediately, because if he goes to d7, e7, queen g7 forces that with a winning position. But now the king escapes, and black has just enough to hold, because the extra bishop, white could avoid the exchange, doesn't really change anything. The extra bishop is able to stop the pawn. It gives itself up, and then queen h8. Now black has an extra pawn, but that's meaningless because white has all these checks, and that's it. They agreed to a draw. So short, sharp struggle with some very interesting tactics. Great game for me. I have something to show you, but it doesn't take all that long. So moving on to other action from this round, and Van Foreest against Shankland. Yeah, this was a kind of heartbreaking finish for Sam. He certainly wanted to build on that win over Karyakin, but bishop f4. Well, we saw fair amount of that in this tournament. It does seem that people want to play these kind of quiet positional openings against Shankland. That they feel that it's best to maybe avoid lots of theory or super short positions. But I mean, here it looks like an exchange Caro-Kann with the bishop stuck on c8. So Sam, makes a radical move to accept the isolated pawn. Otherwise the position looks okay. But then, and I won't dwell on the specifics, he ended up compelled to give a pawn. I guess he didn't want the knight to come to b5. But now he gives his pawn and he blockades it. So it's a long struggle. It's not easy for white to make something of this extra pawn, but Van Foreest nurses position, brings the king. And a lot of things happen, which I won't get into all the minutiae, but eventually we see white getting the king side, black getting the queen side. Not repeating, gaining time on the clock. That's the losing move. Shankland could have held with b3, with the bishop coming to f5, not only stopping the pawn, but just giving a lot of possibilities for black. For instance, if white plays king g3, I think that black can sacrifice this pawn to get bishop e4 and win the bishop. So what can white do? There is an idea to play bishop h5. Black can defend this bishop, bishop f7, rook a6, looking to play rook b6. And if d6, hitting the pawn, black can still play rook b6. And this seems to hold. Yeah. So in any case, you had to do it. Rook a5 is demonstrably losing. Everybody makes a queen. And Sam might have hoped that queen g1 would give him something here, but it doesn't. White has too many checks. And one way that white can win this is to just check on the diagonal and play d6, and there's some other maneuvers that work. Of course, if white gets a check on somewhere in the first rank, he'll be able to win the bishop. But the bishop coming to f1 doesn't help, but it also doesn't help to just try to maintain the position. 2 pawns is 2 pawns. It's I think going to win whether the queens get traded or not. And the not trading the queens actually just makes it quicker, as white has mating threats. And now he finishes it off by picking up the bishop. The final move, queen g5, and he picks up the bishop with check. So okay, I think that's the end of the line for my game. So let's see, what do we have from this tournament? Okay, Magnus Carlsen, 9.5 out of 13, a point and a half ahead of everyone. Report and Mamedyarov had 8 plus 3. They were the closest. Okay, he did have a forfeit win, but still, he put 5 legit wins, and he beat the guys who were on his tail, which certainly helps out your standing, but made that win convincing. Now I'm pretty sure he didn't make it to 2,900 from this event. I think that was a long shot, but he is so far ahead of everyone else. He is just good in every tournament. He's just just constantly outplayed people, and everyone else is up and down. They have their good days and bad days, and for Carlsen, it's big news if he has a bad day. bad day where maybe he misses a win and only draws. So, very decisive finish for him. Richard Report. When I did interviews for my new book, Winning the World Open, Gregory Kaidanov, we asked about their feelings about historical players, and Kaidanov went out of his way to say that of the modern players, he particularly enjoys the chess of Richard Report, and he was saying he's world class. He's really going to go places, and this kind of cements his place up there as one of the elites. And Caruana is another step back, kind of a slump for him. Just didn't get it going. Horrible with the white pieces. Van Fore's an excellent event. I think he managed to get up to +1 at the end. Did it. Very frustrating event. Actually dropped to a minus score with the bad finish. And Praggnanandhaa, okay, obviously took lumps in a lot of games, but he did the thumping 3 times himself, so not a bad result. I also want to mention the B group. Always an interesting mix of players. Not so many veterans as they used to have. Used to be a lot of veterans in the B group. They used to have 3 groups. I don't know if I don't think they'll ever have 3 round robin groups again. But it's mostly young players, and the Indian player Arjan Eragazi, we'll just call him Arjan. There's always a lot of confusion with first and last names with the Indian players anyway. Arjan went even better than Carlsen. 10.5 out of 13, monster score, huge start, coasted to some draws, and then for the good measure, he won basically an even ending in the last round to get to 10.5 out of 13, won by something like 2 points, I think. Pretty impressive. He's actually 18 years old. He was a Grandmaster 14. So, he's been known as a prodigy for a while, and guess really coming into his own with that result. We'll see him in the A group, and there'll be another interesting young player to watch, and there's no shortage of those guys. Of course, everybody wanted to see Firouzja in this event. It was kind of well documented that his handlers asked for too much money, and the organizers did not hide the fact that he asked for too much money, and that's why he wasn't here. So hopefully we'll see him in the big events, because everybody wants to see him. It's thought to be potential challenger for Carlsen, and Carlsen has said, who knows how long he'll be serious about this, that he may not defend his title if it's not against Firouzja, because it's all been there, done that. Anyway, that wraps things up from Wijk aan Zee. It was really a fantastic tournament. It was a pleasure for me to do these videos, because the only problem was that there were some games that I couldn't even talk about, because there were so many decisive games, so many interesting moments, real fighting chess. A credit to the organizers for their invitations, and to the players for really taking it seriously. There were some short draws, but really not that many. I didn't calculate it, but the percentage of decisive games was very high. Certainly over 50%, which you don't even see most of the time in elite tournaments. So great event there in Wijk aan Zee, and they look forward, fingers crossed, to holding the event next year with spectators and an amateur group as well, which they had to cancel because of COVID this year. Well, so thank you all for joining me in these videos and having patience. I know they were kind of long, but I didn't want to leave things out. And see you around sometime. I'm Grandmaster Joel Benjamin. Goodbye.